Let's begin. We're on time. Hi, my name is Alex. I work for Source Distribution. We're the distributors for Mowg. It is Mowg, apparently, not Moog, but yeah, let me know if I say it wrong in the next 20 minutes. Basically, this is the Sub 37. So Mowg produced a bunch of analog synths over the years. It started in 1954, building theremins, theremin kits, actually. And the company has evolved and changed, and over the last 10 years, since about 2002, they produced the Voyager. They started making these new kind of digitally controlled but analog heart synthesizers, and the Voyager was the sort of first in the new range. And there's been a bunch of other synths, but it culminates in the Sub 37, which is the latest and greatest. And the Sub 37 is incredible. It's basically an Excel version of the Sub Fatty. And if you know the Sub Fatty, that was an incredibly precise, fat-sounding synthesizer. And this is basically that with all of the, or not all, but most of the controls on the front panel. So you've got the ability to do cool things like loop the envelopes. You've got 2 modulation buses. Differences between the Sub Fatty, two modulation buses. You also have this duophonic mode, which is very cool, so we can actually play kind of 2 notes at once. We'll look at that in a sec. And then we have this arpeggiator and sequencer section. So let's play. Basically, the key with Moog is just their synths are ludicrously fat. So if I go to a let's go off to a basic sound. There's just an innate, fat, warm character. So this is one oscillator. Basically, one of the hooks that was in the Sub Fatty and also in the Sub 37 is this idea of driving sections of the synthesizer in different ways. So the mixer section here, this is where you set the levels for your oscillator. Up to about the midpoint, it stays relatively clean, but if you drive it beyond the midpoint, it actually starts to drive pre-filter, adds a kind of analog drive element. And then there's this thing called multi-drive, which is a post-filter distortion. So you can have it clean, but you can drive it into the filter, and then you can drive it after the filter. So it's got this kind of gritty character, basically, like this warm fatness. So you can kind of like age the sound in a way. That's kind of the best way of describing it. You've got the Moog ladder filter. And the multi-drive's a nice way of compensating for some of the drop you get from adding resonance. So that's one oscillator. Of course, there is 2. So if we bring in the second one, the second oscillator we can tune. And then we have this thing called beat frequency, which is like an extra fine control. So where you have the 2 waveforms when they're kind of phasing together. It lets you kind of dial in that sort of variation, kind of phasing. And then of course you can detune them. Of course, it's a Sub Fatty, so there is a sub oscillator as well, in case there wasn't enough bass for you. So the sub oscillator is a square wave. Here and there. So it's just like a ludicrously fat-sounding machine. There's a load of variability to be had in that, just the mixer section and the filter alone. But obviously, we've got tons of modulation. So let's look at that. Basically, you have 2 envelope generators here, just like the Sub Fatty. The difference here is that there's a bunch of extra controls for them. So they're actually more complicated. They're actually delay, attack, hold, decay, sustain, and release envelopes, which sounds very complicated. But it isn't really. Delays, we access that here, so that we're now controlling the delay element. So it just means that basically when we hit a key, there'll be a little pause. It should be anyway. Before the filter, before the envelope acts. and then you have the attack stage, and then a hold, which is at the top of the attack stage. You get these kind of complex envelopes, basically. But we can loop them, which is the coolest feature. So if I can try and make this work. We can speed this up. Which is cool, so it kind of makes the envelopes into almost like LFOs. And they can be synced with sync buttons, so that they'll sync to the arpeggiators like as a master clock. And what's cool is that the LFOs in the Modbus will also sync too. So you kind of have 4 syncable modulation options. You've got the envelopes which can sync, and you've also got the LFOs that can sync. It's really cool, so you can get all the kind of crazy modulation occurring that's all musically tied in. Modulation buses are here, you have 2. And in terms of sources, there's a bunch of waveforms. Let's actually play with it. So this is the mod one, and I apply modulation. Filter. And you use, by default, the mod wheel to engage that, which is cool. So if you do kind of speed this up, make it a bit faster. It's cool being able to bring that in and out using the mod wheel. You can change that behavior if you want. But then you do actually also have an extra destination. There are 3 kind of destinations. So pitch and filter are by default with dedicated controls. But down here, we can send them off to control a bunch of different things. You can see here there's oscillator waveforms, which is very cool. So you can mod this control, basically. So I apply this. And then you have a bidirectional control. So it lets us do kind of pulse width modulation. There's a bunch of other destinations here. The most interesting one is down here at the bottom right, which is the program. So that allows us to send modulation to almost any parameter in the synth. It's really cool. There's a brilliant little printout where you can see all of the destinations, and it's like this enormous block of text. To decide where they go, you push this button here, the controllers, and if you can see the screen, you might not be able to see it on here, but we go down here to Mod 1 Edit, and this lets us choose the source, which can be any one of these, or we also have programmable sources, and there's a bunch of different ones. And then here's the cool bit, the destination. So there's just tons and tons of different places that you can send modulation to. Some of the most interesting ones, you can actually send modulation to control the arpeggiator rate, things like that. So you can have these kind of wonky arpeggiators, which are slowing and speeding up. You can also, there's a filter slope selection here, so we can actually change the entire character of the filter from being 24-pole Moog ladder to 6-pole, which has a different innate character. And actually, one of the modulation destinations is like the slope itself, so you can modulate this with an LFO, which is really cool and strange. So if you get into it, there's a ton of interesting modulation to be had, beyond just an innate, simple, fat character. I guess that's kind of the key difference between the Sub-Fatty, is just this idea of tons of modulation and tons of control on the front panel. So, awesome thing that they've added here is the arpeggiator. So we didn't have an arpeggiator on the original Sub-Fatty. This one's really complicated. We've got a bunch of different pattern types. So if I put it on here, and we can latch, so you can we can invert, which probably make more sense when I. And then we have range, and then a rate control. It's kind of free running at the moment, but that can be synced. It has USB and MIDI on the side, so you can sync this to DAW or a drum machine or what have you. I love just messing around with these things when they're just rolling along like this. I think sequencers are amazing. Adding them to a machine is genius. It's a simple thing, but just so fun to be able to come up with melodic ideas. So you can see here that our LFO is synced, so it's musically related to the arpeggiator clock. Okay, now, it's not just an arpeggiator, there is also a sequencer in here. This is awesome. So basically, with the sequencer, you can see these two little white sections. This is sequencer mode, this is record mode. When we're in record mode, it's kind of armed. So any key presses I make are going to get stored to the memory as a little sequence. And you can use these buttons to add rests, and you can also add ties, which is like a slide between the notes, very kind of 303-like. So if I just put in some notes, let's... see what we got there. So put it into sequencer mode. And if I latch that, again, I'm hands-free. And then we can transpose. Bonkers. One of the key differences between the Sub-Fatty and the Sub-37 is this duophonic mode. So, well, it's not duophonic, I should be very clear on this, it's paraphonic, which means that basically we can kind of play two notes at once. And the way that that works is that if you imagine, you know, a normal two-oscillator synthesizer, you've got, here are two oscillators, and they follow whichever key we're pressing. And we can usually offset. You can tune the second oscillator differently, so you can get this kind of almost like a chord, but it will always be tied to the note that you're playing. This duo mode means that actually the two oscillators will run off and respond to the key presses. So we're kind of getting two notes at once, and it's using one oscillator for one and a second oscillator for the other. You have this keyboard control here, which chooses the sort of priority of the notes to suit certain types of playing styles. Of course, they're sharing a filter, but because they're separate, they're responding to these wave controls, so we can have, you know, a different wave for the lower note versus the higher note. It's really interesting. I'm not much of a keyboard player, but if you were, I'm sure there's lots of tons of cool stuff that you can do, different playing styles, and things that weren't possible because before on a Moog synth, because obviously all the oscillators were going to be tied to the root note. So duophonic modes, or the paraphonic duo mode will be really interesting. I'm kind of looking forward to see what people do with it. Coming back to the sequencer though, because it has this duo mode, I discovered that the sequencer will actually store double key presses, which is awesome, as in you can do duophonic sequencing. So let me try and do that. So if I put it into record R mode, in theory, if I push two keys, see what happens. Maybe that. So you get this kind of double note, like a duophonic sequence, basically. Sorry, duo paraphonic. I'll get that right one day. It's just really cool. There are a bunch of presets in the machine. I'll show you down here. So you see we actually have 256 presets. The Sub-Fatty has only 16, but 256 in the Sub-37. They're arranged into 16 banks of 16. So you hit bank here, this is bank 1, and that's preset 1. Quite like that one. So I mean, there's a ton of presets. If you don't want to get into the sound design aspect, it's all kind of there. So it's obviously for stage work, very, very, very cool, and very stable as well. That's kind of, I didn't really mention that before, but and it seems like something you shouldn't have to think about. But a lot of the technology that Moog have been developing recently has been to do with the stabilization and making these things absolutely rock solid, so that if they're used on stage in environments that are cold and hot, they don't drift out of tune. You can power cycle these things and they stay very stable. They don't need a long warm-up time, which is a recent development. And again, it doesn't sound like the most exciting thing in the world, but actually the stability leads to things like this beat frequency. It allows you to have very consistent phasing. So if you've got like the oscillators closely phasing in a really pleasing way, you can move across the keyboard, and that phasing relationship will maintained. It won't drift because of temperature changes as the synth warms and changes. It's just very stable, very reliable. And combined with the fact that you've got a ton of presets, you can also, in a studio situation, all of these knobs send and receive MIDI. So this is sending MIDI and it will receive it as well. So you can plug this in via USB and you can automate the hell out of the panel, basically. So it's a very kind of, it's very old school at its heart, but it's very modern in its implementation, which is kind of common of Moog. The Sub Fatty does that as well, as does the Minotaur. They all have, proper MIDI response. So that's probably enough on the Sub 37. We are at booth A59, by the way, which is just down here. So if you want to come and have a go on the Sub 37, we have 2 machines. Come and play, and thanks very much for watching. Cheers, guys.